The guard's fist slammed into my ribs, hard. I tasted blood, my fingers still clutching the flash drive. My husband's name was on the receipt for the bug in my therapy sessions. Now I'm trapped in Eleanor's wing, the encrypted files burning in my pocket. And the only way out is through the hands that just broke my ribs. Too late, I realized. Mark wasn't just her puppet. He was her weapon. The scent of damp mulch and over-fertilized roses clung to the service gardens, thick enough to coat the back of Sarah Miller's throat. She pressed the manila envelope against her thigh, the weight of the bills reassuring and heavy. Across the stone path, Rosa stood by the compost bins, her fingers twitching against the hem of her gray apron. The distant hum of a lawnmower chewed through the morning silence of the Greenwich estate. Sarah stepped into the shadow of a towering hedge, the emerald leaves blocking the harsh Connecticut sun. Rosa followed, her gaze darting toward the security cameras angled away from this specific corner. The air here was cooler, smelling of turned earth and secret intentions. "You brought it?" Rosa's voice scraped like gravel over a dry road. Sarah extended the envelope. The paper crinkled, a loud, sharp sound in the stillness. "Count it if you need to." Rosa snatched the package, her thumb flicking the edges of the $100 bills. A smudge of potting soil stained the top note, a dark mark on the face of Ben Franklin. Satisfied, the maid reached into her pocket and pulled out a slim, white plastic rectangle. The master keycard caught the sunlight, gleaming with clinical indifference. "Mr. Greenwich changes the codes on Mondays," Rosa whispered, sliding the card into Sarah's palm. The plastic remained warm from her skin, a lingering heat that made Sarah's skin prickle. "You have 3 days. After that, I report it missing." Sarah gripped the card, the sharp edges digging into her thumb. "The study upstairs. Is the biometric lock active?" Rosa tucked the cash into her bodice, the paper rasping against her uniform. "He grows careless after his 3rd scotch. Check the floor safe behind the portrait. He leaves the sensor off when he's drinking." The maid turned, disappearing into the labyrinth of greenery without a parting word. Sarah slipped the keycard into her silk lining. Her pulse thrummed against her collarbone, rhythmic and steady, as she walked toward the side entrance of the limestone manor. Every step on the gravel sounded like a countdown. She wasn't just a wife returning home. She was a ghost infiltrating a fortress. The side door hummed as the keycard made contact with the sensor. A small green light blinked, a tiny emerald eye granting her passage into the belly of the beast. Sarah stepped into the mudroom, where the smell of expensive leather boots and lemon polish replaced the garden's decay. She waited, lungs burning, until the door clicked shut behind her. The silence of the house was heavy, pressurized, like the air inside a submarine deep underwater. She moved through the service corridor, her footsteps silent on the Persian runners. She knew the schedule of this house better than her own heartbeat. Eleanor would be in the solarium, overseeing the floral arrangements for the upcoming gala. And Mark would be at the firm, or perhaps at the firm, a distinction Sarah had learned to make months ago. Reaching the heavy mahogany doors of Eleanor's private wing, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was the heart of the Miller Empire, a place where secrets were kept behind gold-leafed frames and velvet curtains. She swiped the card again. The lock gave a satisfying, mechanical thud. The office was a shrine to old money. The scent of stale tobacco and expensive stationery hung in the air. Sarah didn't head for the files or the computer. She went straight to the desk, a massive, claw-footed beast of a piece. Her fingers traced the underside of the central drawer, searching for the imperfection Rosa had described. A small, recessed catch hidden in the grain of the wood. There. A click, muffled by the heavy carpet. A panel slid back, revealing a hollow space. Inside sat a silver flash drive, its metallic casing cold to the touch. Sarah snatched it, her fingers trembling for the first time. This small piece of metal held the digital trail of Eleanor's greed, the diverted funds, the shell companies, the systematic draining of Mark's law firm to keep the family estate afloat. It was Sarah's ticket out, the leverage she needed to break the prenuptial agreement that felt more like a death warrant. She tucked the drive into her bra, the cold metal biting into her skin. She had to move. The house felt like it was breathing, the walls closing in. As she turned to leave, a floorboard groaned. It was a small sound, but in the vacuum of the manor, it sounded like a gunshot. Sarah froze. From the hallway, the rhythmic heavy tread of boots approached. It wasn't the light, rhythmic step of a maid or the polished click of Eleanor's heels. It was James Peterson, the head of security. The monster Sarah heard humming through the walls at night. She ducked behind the door just as it swung open. The smell of James hit her first, unwashed wool and peppermint gum. He stepped into the room, his massive frame blocking the light from the hallway. Sarah held her breath, her heart hammering so hard she feared he would hear it. James scanned the room, his scowl deepening. He moved toward the desk, his hand hovering over the very spot where Sarah had been standing seconds before. He began to hum, a low, discordant funeral dirge that vibrated in Sarah's chest. The sound was a warning, a predator's growl before the strike. Just as he turned toward her hiding spot, the distant chime of the front doorbell echoed through the house. James stopped. The humming ceased. He grunted, a wet, guttural sound, and turned on his heel to investigate the intrusion. Sarah didn't wait. She slipped out of the office, her movements a blur of desperate grace. She didn't go back to the service entrance. She headed for the kitchen, the shortest path to the driveway. She burst through the swinging doors of the kitchen, nearly colliding with a rack of copper pots that chimed like bells. She didn't stop to apologize. She ran. Out the back door, across the pristine lawn, her lungs screaming for air. At the edge of the property, a battered silver sedan idled near the stone gate. Tommy, her younger brother, was behind the wheel, his heel bouncing a frantic rhythm against the floor mat. As Sarah dove into the passenger seat, the smell of fast food and old upholstery hit her, the smell of safety. "Go!" she hissed. Tommy didn't ask questions. He slammed the car into gear, the tires screaming as they tore a strip of rubber onto the asphalt. Sarah looked back at the receding limestone towers of the estate. She had the drive. She had the truth. But as the car accelerated, Tommy reached into the center console and pulled out a small, crumpled slip of paper. His hands were shaking, grease-stained cuticles white against the steering wheel. "Sarah," he said, his voice cracking. "I found something else while I was waiting. In the glove box of the SUV Mark left at the shop for a tune-up." He handed her a receipt. It was from a high-end electronics boutique in Manhattan. The item was a living room ambient monitor, a fancy name for a bugging device. The date on the receipt was 3 months ago. The name on the credit card used for the purchase wasn't Eleanor Miller. It was Mark. Sarah stared at the paper. The realization hit her like a physical blow, a cold wave of nausea rolling through her gut. Mark hadn't just been a passive observer of his mother's cruelty. He had been listening, Every session with Dr. Thorne, every tear she had shed in the supposed safety of therapy, every plan she had whispered to herself in the dark, he had heard it all. The man she shared a bed with was the one who had turned her sanctuary into a stage. The spreadsheet in her mind, the 142 logged apologies, suddenly felt woefully incomplete. She hadn't been documenting a marriage. She had been documenting a surveillance operation. 12, 13, 14, Tommy whispered, his heels still bouncing. He was counting the fence posts as they blurred past. Sarah gripped the flash drive through her clothes. The weight of the bills in her pocket felt like lead. The game had changed. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about survival. The heat of the Connecticut summer felt different inside the Miller estate. Heavier, more calculated. 3 days had passed since Sarah had secured the flash drive, and the air in the manor was thick with the scent of lilies and floor wax. Eleanor had moved the 4th of July gala up. The celebration of independence, as the invitations called it, was now only 48 hours away. Sarah sat at the vanity in her bedroom, her fingers tracing the delicate lace of her sleeve. She could hear Mark in the dressing room, the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of his knuckles echoing against the marble. Thumb, index, pinky. 3 times. The herald of a lie. He stepped out, adjusting his silk tie in the mirror. He looked perfect, the image of a devoted husband and a rising legal star. He approached Sarah, his hands resting on her shoulders. His touch was cold, even through the fabric of her robe. "You look tired, honey," Mark said, his voice a smooth, liquid baritone. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. "I'm worried about you. All this stress with the gala. Maybe you should see Dr. Thorne again this afternoon." Sarah looked at his reflection. She saw the predatory stillness in his eyes, the way he watched her for any sign of deviation, as she called it in her logs. She knew the microphones were hidden in the crown molding, in the base of the lamp, perhaps even in the very mirror she was staring into. "I'm fine, Mark," she said, her voice a flat, analytical drone. "My energy levels are within the normal range for a week of high-intensity planning." Mark smiled, that warm, fatherly smile that never reached his eyes. "We just want you to be yourself for the party. The real Sarah, not this auditor version." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a necklace. Diamonds set in platinum, glittering like shards of ice. "A peace offering? For my late nights at the office?" Sarah let him fasten the cold metal around her neck. She felt like a dog being fitted with a new collar. As he leaned down to kiss her cheek, she smelled the faint, metallic tang of the pre-lie ritual. He was lying about the late nights. He was lying about the worry. He was probably even lying about the price of the necklace. She waited until he left for the office, the sound of his BMW fading down the long driveway. Every minute was a resource she couldn't afford to waste. She had to decrypt the files on the silver drive. But her home laptop was compromised. She could feel the eyes of the house on her. She called Tommy from a burner phone she kept hidden in a hollowed-out book. The industrial park, exit 4, 1 hour. The drive to the meeting point was a blur of gray asphalt and oppressive heat. Sarah kept her eyes on the rearview mirror, watching for the telltale flicker of a tail. She saw nothing but suburban SUVs and delivery trucks, but the feeling of being hunted didn't leave her. It was a phantom weight on her chest. The industrial park was a wasteland of corrugated metal and cracked concrete. She pulled her car into the shadow of a warehouse, the engine ticking as it cooled. The smell of burning rubber and diesel exhaust hung in the air. She saw the whistleblower's car, a nondescript black sedan. parked near a row of rusted shipping containers. This was the man who had promised the final piece of the puzzle, the link between Eleanor's fraud and the local political machine. Sarah stepped out of her car, the heat hitting her like a physical wall. She walked toward the sedan, her hand on the manila envelope containing the bribe money. "Are you here?" she called out. Her voice sounded small in the vast, empty space. Suddenly, the roar of a high-performance engine shattered the silence. A massive black SUV, windows tinted to the color of midnight, tore around the corner of the warehouse. It didn't slow down. It aimed directly for Sarah's car. The impact was a deafening crunch of metal and glass. Sarah's sedan was tossed aside like a toy, spinning across the asphalt before tumbling down the steep embankment at the edge of the lot. Sarah threw herself to the ground, the grit of the pavement scraping her palms. The black SUV skidded to a halt, the doors flying open. A masked figure lunged toward her, a heavy tire iron swinging in a lethal arc. Sarah rolled, the metal whistling past her ear and striking the concrete with a bone-jarring thud. She didn't scream. She didn't have the breath for it. She scrambled toward the embankment, her eyes fixed on the smoking wreckage of her car. Her laptop, the drive, everything was in there. The assailant grabbed her by the hair, dragging her back. The smell of peppermint gum and stale wool hit her. James. Even behind the mask, she knew the weight of his hands. He pinned her against the hot metal of the SUV, his fingers crushing her windpipe. Sarah's vision began to swim, the world tilting into a blur of gray and black. She felt the inclusionary we of the Miller family tightening around her throat. With a desperate surge of strength, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, silver-plated scissors Eleanor used to trim threads. She drove the blades into James's forearm. He roared, a wet, guttural sound, and released his grip. Sarah didn't look back. She slid down the embankment, the tall grass tearing at her clothes. She reached the car, the smell of leaking coolant and scorched plastic filling her lungs. She grabbed her bag from the passenger seat, her fingers closing around the cold metal of the flash drive. She crawled back up the slope, her heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic sequence. She reached the road, just as Tommy's silver sedan screeched to a halt. "Get in!" Tommy yelled. As they sped away, Sarah looked at her hands. They were covered in grease and blood. She looked at the laptop bag in her lap. It was dented, the screen likely shattered. "We have to get to the safe house," she whispered. "Now." Subverted. The safe house was a cramped, two-room cabin, tucked deep into the woods of upstate New York, miles from the nearest paved road. The air inside smelled of pine needles and old wood smoke, a sharp contrast to the sterile, perfumed halls of the Greenwich estate. Sarah sat at a small wooden table, her breath hitching as she watched Tommy connect the silver flash drive to a rugged, military-grade computer he'd brought from the city. This was the moment of clarity. Sarah felt a surge of cold, analytical confidence. She had outrun James, survived the crash, and kept the drive. Her logic was sound. The drive contained the financial records Eleanor had been hiding, the proof of the shell companies, and the embezzled funds. With this data, Sarah could dismantle the Miller empire, piece by piece. She had the expertise, the evidence, and the drive. She felt the weight of the past months lifting, a sense of impending victory cooling her skin. "I'm through the first layer," Tommy muttered, his fingers flying across the keys. A green progress bar crawled across the screen. "The encryption is heavy, but it's standard Miller corporate stuff. They're arrogant, Sarah. They didn't think anyone would get this far." Sarah nodded, a small, tight smile touching her lips. "If they're arrogant, they're vulnerable. Once we have the spreadsheets, we go straight to the feds. No more games. The progress bar hit 100%. A folder popped open, labeled Project Legacy. Tommy clicked it, his shoulders dropping as he relaxed. We got it. It's all here. Audio files, PDFs, the whole audit trail. He opened the first audio file. Sarah leaned in, expecting to hear Eleanor's voice discussing offshore accounts or bribing officials. The sound that filled the small cabin was Sarah's own voice. "I did it," the recording said. Sarah's voice was shaky, filled with a horrific, wet sobbing. "I didn't mean to, but he wouldn't stop screaming. The knife, it was just there on the counter. I just wanted the noise to stop." Sarah froze. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. She watched the waveform on the screen, a jagged, pulsing line that matched the cadence of her own speech perfectly. That's not me," Sarah whispered. Her throat felt tight, as if James's hands were still there. "I never said that. I've never even seen a knife like that." Tommy paused the recording, his face pale in the blue light of the monitor. "Sarah, what is this? This sounds like a confession." "Keep playing," Sarah commanded, her voice a brittle shard of glass. The recording continued. "I buried the body in the service garden, under the roses. Eleanor helped me. She said we had to keep it in the family. We used the lie from the shed to make sure nothing was left." The sound of the recording was flawless. The slight catch in Sarah's throat when she was nervous, the specific way she pronounced her S sounds, the rhythmic pauses for breath. It was all there. It was a masterpiece of digital assassination. The crack in the plan appeared slowly. Sarah noticed the metadata at the bottom of the screen. The file wasn't a recording of a conversation. It was a composite. Thousands of tiny snippets of her voice, taken from the bugs in her bedroom, her therapy sessions, her phone calls, stitched together with a terrifyingly sophisticated AI. Then she saw the final file in the folder. It was a video. She clicked it. The screen showed a grainy, night vision shot of the Greenwich Gardens. A woman who looked exactly like Sarah, wearing Sarah's favorite silk robe, was struggling with a heavy, human-shaped bundle near the compost bins. The woman looked up at the camera for a split second, her face a mask of cold-blooded resolve. It was Chloe, the voice actress. The ghost in the machine. The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The flash drive hadn't been a hidden stash of Eleanor's crimes. It had been a trap, planted for Sarah to find. Eleanor and Mark hadn't just been spying on her. They had been building a digital cage, a narrative so perfect and so damning that no amount of truth could ever break it. By stealing the drive, Sarah hadn't secured her freedom. She had hand-delivered the evidence of her own crimes to the very person who wanted to destroy her. "The police," Tommy whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "If they find this on us, if they see we have this drive..." "We're not the ones who found the evidence," Sarah realized, her voice trembling. "We're the ones who were caught trying to hide it." A low, vibrating hum began to echo through the cabin walls. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of a funeral dirge, buzzing in the floorboards. Outside, the blue and red lights of police cruisers began to flicker through the trees, reflecting off the dark glass of the windows, like predatory eyes. Sarah looked at the silver drive. It wasn't a key. It was a tombstone. The 4th of July gala at the Miller Estate was a masterclass in paranoid elegance. The gold-leafed mirrors of the grand ballroom reflected the hundreds of guests in their black tie finery, creating an endless hall of watching eyes. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, one specific bulb pulsing out of sync with the others. A hypnotic rhythm that made the whole room feel like it was breathing. Sarah stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, her evening gown a shimmering sheath of midnight blue that felt like a burial shroud. Her skin was pale, her eyes scanning the crowd with a desperate, analytical intensity. She had escaped the safe house through a back window, leaving Tommy to lead the police on a wild chase through the woods. But she knew her time was a dwindling resource. She saw Eleanor in the center of the room, her silver hair pulled back into that familiar, tight mask. Eleanor was moving through the guests, her silver-plated scissors occasionally flashing as she trimmed a loose thread from a senator's lapel or a socialite's sleeve. It was a physical reminder of her power, the ability to cut anyone out of the narrative. Mark was on the stage, his hands gripping the mahogany podium. He looked toward the mezzanine, his eyes finding Sarah's with a cold, predatory precision. He cracked his knuckles, thumb, index, pinky, 3 times. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mark's voice boomed through the speakers, smooth and expansive. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just our nation's independence. We celebrate the strength of family, the courage to face the darkness, even when it lives within our own walls." The guests fell silent, their faces expectant, reflecting the flickering light of the chandelier. "Many of you have heard the rumors," Mark continued, his voice dropping to a sympathetic whisper. "The tragic rumors about my dear wife, Sarah. We had hoped to handle this privately, to give her the medical care she so desperately needs. But the truth is a debt that must be paid." He gestured to the massive screen behind him. "This is a tribute to the woman I loved and the shadow she became." The tribute video began to play. It was a seamless blend of the deep fake audio and the night vision footage Sarah had seen in the cabin. The ballroom was filled with the sound of Sarah's confession, her voice echoing off the gold-leafed walls, raw and horrifying. The guests recoiled, a collective gasp rippling through the room like a wave. Sarah felt the world tilting. She saw the validation seeker, Chloe, standing near the bar, her face a mask of practiced sorrow. Chloe caught Sarah's eye and whispered something to the empty air, her lips moving in a silent, "You know?" At the edge of the stage, a man in a rumpled suit stepped forward. Detective Robert Evans. He looked tired, his eyes fixed on the screen, his hand already reaching for the handcuffs on his belt. He was wearing a perfectly clean white shirt, the first of his 3 daily rotations. "Sarah Miller," Evans called out, his voice carrying over the recording. "You need to come with us." Sarah didn't move. She couldn't. She was publicly ruined, her reputation shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Eleanor's lawyer, a man with a face like a hawk, stepped toward her, holding a stack of legal documents. "Emergency custody papers, Mrs. Miller," the lawyer said, his voice a dry rasp. "Signed by a judge an hour ago. You are no longer permitted contact with your children, for their own safety." The words hit Sarah harder than the car crash. Her children. The only things that weren't part of the spreadsheet, the only things that were real. She looked at Eleanor, who was watching her with a triumphant, icy smile. Eleanor leaned in toward a guest, her scissors snipping a thread from the air. Sarah's mind, the mind of a systems analyst, began to whir. She looked at the massive AV rack at the side of the stage, the blue-tinted lights of the processors blinking in a rhythmic sequence. She remembered the estate's layout, the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the ballroom, the server room that controlled every light, every speaker, every camera in the house. The system was a machine, and every machine had a back door. She didn't run for the exit. She ran for the service stairs. She dove into the maintenance tunnel, the air smelling of grease and old stone. She could hear the heavy tread of boots behind her. James, his low funeral dirge echoing through the narrow passage. 12, 13, 14, she whispered, her own heel bouncing as she navigated the dark. She reached the server room, the pressurized air hissing as she swiped the master keycard she'd kept hidden in her gown. The room was a cathedral of blue light and high-pitched whines. In the center, sitting on $1 million mainframe, was a half-eaten ham sandwich, the only organic thing in the room, rotting in the sterile cold. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't try to shut the video down. She did something better. She accessed the house's internal surveillance archive, the raw, unedited footage that Mark and Eleanor used to monitor their own staff. She found the file from 3 nights ago. The solarium. On the massive screens in the ballroom, the deep fake video suddenly flickered and died. In its place, a new image appeared. It was Eleanor and Dr. Thorne. They were sitting in the solarium, surrounded by lilies. Eleanor was holding a silver-plated scissors, lazily trimming the petals of a flower. "The recording is perfect, Richard." Eleanor's voice boomed through the ballroom, stripped of its public warmth. Chloe's voice is a dead ringer for Sarah's. Once we play it at the gala, the board will have no choice but to remove her from the trust. Mark will have total control. Dr. Thorne cleaned his spectacles with a silk cloth. "And the confession? You're sure the police will buy it?" "The police buy what I tell them to buy," Eleanor said, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "Sarah is a bug in the system, Richard. And I am the one who writes the code." The ballroom went silent. The kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Sarah stood in the server room, her hands shaking as she watched the screen. She saw Mark on the stage, his face turning the color of ash. He looked toward the mezzanine, but Sarah wasn't there. She was the one writing the code now. Ominous moment. The aftermath of the gala was a slow-motion collapse. The police, led by a visibly shaken Detective Evans, had moved from Sarah to Eleanor and Mark within minutes of the broadcast. The clean-shirt detective hadn't even bothered to change his shirt for the 3rd time that day. He just stood there, looking at the screen, a smudge of ink on his cuff that he didn't even notice. Sarah walked through the empty ballroom, the scent of spilled champagne and expensive perfume hanging in the air like a ghost. The guests had fled, leaving behind a graveyard of silk napkins and half-eaten hors d'oeuvres. She saw Jennifer, the young maid, sitting on the edge of the stage. Jennifer was shaking, her hands gripped tight in her lap. She was whispering, "Sorry, Mr. Floor," as she looked at a scuff mark on the polished wood. Sarah stopped. She was exhausted, her dress torn, her heart a hollowed-out shell. She had an appointment with a high-powered lawyer in an hour, a meeting that would decide the rest of her life. She didn't have time for this, but she saw the way Jennifer flinched when a distant door slammed. She saw the same walls-up demeanor that had been Sarah's own armor for 10 years. Sarah walked over and sat down on the cold wood next to the girl. "Jennifer," Sarah said, her voice soft. Jennifer jumped, her eyes wide with terror. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller. I'll get back to work. I'll clean it all up." "It's okay," Sarah said. She reached out and took Jennifer's hand. The girl's skin was cold, her pulse a frantic, rhythmic tapping against Sarah's palm. "You don't have to apologize to the floor anymore. They're gone. Eleanor and Mark, they're not coming back." Jennifer looked at her, a single tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. They said if I talked to you, they'd send me back. To the place with the lockers. I can't go back there." Sarah felt a sharp, physical pain in her chest. She knew the place with the lockers. It was the same kind of threat Eleanor had used to keep everyone in line, a reminder that they were disposable, that their lives were just data points to be deleted. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. It was the bribe money she had intended for the whistleblower. $10,000 in crisp, $100 bills. "Take this," Sarah said, pressing the envelope into Jennifer's hand. Jennifer shook her head, her breath hitching. "I can't. I didn't do anything to help you. I hid your letters. I was too scared." "I know," Sarah said. She squeezed the girl's hand. "I'm not giving this to you for what you did. I'm giving it to you so you can go somewhere where you don't have to be scared anymore. Go to your sisters in Ohio. Start over." "But the lawyer," Jennifer whispered. "You need the money for the lawyer." Sarah looked around the ruined ballroom. She thought of the 142 apologies in her spreadsheet. She thought of the silver scissors and the funeral dirge. She had lost her marriage, her home, and her reputation. But as she looked at the young woman in front of her, she realized she hadn't lost herself. "The lawyer can wait," Sarah said. "You can't." She stayed with Jennifer until the girls' ride arrived, carrying the heavy bags to the car herself. When the sedan pulled away, Sarah stood on the graveled driveway of the Greenwich estate for the last time. She was broke, she was tired, and she was alone. But for the first time in her life, the air didn't smell like decay. It smelled like the morning after a storm, sharp, clean, and full of possibilities. 6 months later, the skyline of Boston was a jagged silhouette of glass and steel against a cold, winter sky. Sarah Miller stood in her new office, the scent of fresh paint and expensive coffee filling the room. It was a small space, but the windows were large, letting in the relentless, chaotic energy of the city. She looked at the brass plaque on the door. Miller and Associates, Advocacy and Systems Analysis. She didn't use the Miller name because she missed it. She used it because she had reclaimed it. It was no longer a brand of fear, it was a brand of protection. Tommy was in the corner, his heel bouncing as he worked on a new encryption protocol for their clients. Women who, like Sarah, were trapped in digital cages. He was counting the steps of the new office out loud, but he was smiling. 12, 13, 14, he whispered. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was a message from her lawyer. The settlement had been finalized. The Greenwich estate was being sold, the proceeds going into a trust for her children. Mark and Eleanor were facing 20 years for wiretapping, fraud, and conspiracy. She looked at her computer screen. The apology log was still there, but the last entry was different. It wasn't a data point. It wasn't a quote. It was a note to herself. 10 a.m. I woke up. The air was cold. I didn't check the sensors. I didn't count the breaths. I just lived. Sincerity level, 100%. Sarah Miller closed the spreadsheet. She didn't need the data anymore. She had the truth. And as she looked out over the city, she realized that the most powerful system in the world wasn't a machine. It was a human heart that refused to break. The hum of the city was loud, chaotic, and beautiful. It was the sound of independence. The end.